I've always been the type of person who takes the long, lonely routes. Call it wanderlust or just a need for solitude. But when I can, I avoid highways and busy interstates, opting instead for back roads that slice through sleepy towns and endless forests. It was a Friday night, just past midnight, and I was driving along one of those quiet, winding roads deep in the hills of Tennessee. I was heading home after a few days in the city. My mind was heavy with thoughts, and the radio static didn't seem to ease the growing tension in my chest. The night was thick, with fog clinging to the curves of the road, but that's nothing unusual for this part of the world. The headlights barely cut through the mist. The further I drove, the more I felt like I was slipping into some other world, a liminal space between the present and the past. Every now and then, I would see a distant set of headlights creeping up behind me, only for them to vanish into the darkness as if they'd never existed. I was so wrapped up in my thoughts that I didn't see him until it was too late. I first noticed the figure standing by the side of the road in a dim flash of my headlights. It startled me and I slammed the brake. My car skidded slightly before coming to a stop just a few feet from the man. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, and dressed in a faded leather jacket, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. His thumb stuck out, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I've always been told to never pick up hitchhikers. It's common sense, right? Especially out here in the middle of nowhere. But for some reason, this time I couldn't shake the thought that I should. There was something about him, something compelling. The way he stood still, unmoving, like he was waiting for me. Not nervous, not desperate, just patient. My hand hovered over the door handle for a moment. What harm could it do? After all, I wasn't far from the nearest town. I figured I could drop him off at the gas station and be on my way. I rolled down the window slightly, the cold night air creeping in. "You need a ride?" I called out, my voice a little hoarse. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly raised his head, and I saw his face, pale too pale. His skin had a sickly grayish tint, like something had drained the life from him. His eyes were too dark, black as pitch, and they locked onto mine with a weight that made my stomach turn. "Yes," he said simply, his voice a rasp, like sandpaper on stone. Without thinking further, I unlocked the door. He didn't hesitate. The man opened the passenger door and slid into the seat next to me with an eerie smoothness, like he hadn't actually walked but drifted across the ground. A faint, musty odor clung to him, something old and rotten, but I tried not to dwell on it. I forced a smile. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," he replied, his gaze fixed on the mist rolling outside the window. I nodded and pressed the gas pedal, the tires rolling over the damp pavement. The road stretched on ahead, narrow and unforgiving, with trees looming on either side like silent watchers. The silence between us was thick, and I could feel the weight of his presence beside me, as though he was no longer just a passenger but something far more insidious. "I've never seen you around here," I said after a while, trying to break the silence. "You from out of town?" He didn't answer right away, just stared out the window, his face half shrouded in shadow. Finally, he spoke in a tone that was far too calm for the eerie silence of the night. "Not from here," he said. "I'm just passing through." I glanced at him, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something in his voice, the way it didn't quite match the way his lips moved, set me on edge. He wasn't right. The next few miles were quiet, and I tried to push my unease aside. After all, it was just a hitchhiker, right? Maybe I was being paranoid. But then, the mist began to thicken, the fog wrapping around the car like it was alive. The road twisted tighter, and soon, I couldn't see much more than a few feet in front of the car. Then, out of nowhere, the man spoke again. "Do you know why the road's so quiet?" he asked, his voice low and almost too casual. I blinked, surprised by the question. "I mean, it's late, isn't it? People are probably sleeping." He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "No, it's because the road, it's not really there anymore." I glanced at him, a chill creeping down my spine. "What do you mean?" "The road has forgotten itself," he said cryptically, his lips curling into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not a road at all. It's something else. It doesn't go where you think it does. My heart skipped a beat. A strange, unsettling feeling filled the car, as if the air itself had grown heavier. I forced myself to focus on the road, trying to push aside the creeping sense of dread. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You're not headed to where you think you're going," he repeated, his words slow and deliberate. "You're already lost." I laughed nervously. "I'm not lost. I know where I'm going." But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The road had started to feel wrong, like it had changed when I wasn't looking. I glanced at the rearview mirror, but the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't even make out the road behind me. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Where exactly are we?" The man's smile widened, and for the first time, I noticed something strange about his teeth. Long and pointed, like animal fangs. But before I could react, the car lurched forward, as though the ground beneath us had shifted. The tires skidded over something soft and uneven, and the engine sputtered, its lights flickering in and out. "Relax," the man said, his voice dripping with something dark. "It's only just beginning." The car jerked again, this time harder, and I fought to keep control. But it felt as though the world around me was warping. The trees pressed in tighter, their branches reaching out like claws, the road twisting and winding in impossible ways. And then, just like that, the car stopped moving entirely. The engine was dead. No lights, no sound, just the oppressive weight of the darkness around me. I turned to the man, but he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and in the place where he had been, a strange, sticky residue coated the fabric, like something had melted into it. Panic surged through me. I slammed the door open, stumbling out into the fog. The air was thick, damp, and the trees loomed like towering sentinels, blocking out the moonlight. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked around, but there was no sign of the road, no sign of anything familiar, just endless mist, stretching out in every direction. That's when I heard the sound. Faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But then, it grew louder, a soft, insistent chanting. Low, guttural voices that rose and fell like an ancient incantation. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. Tall, too tall, its face hidden by the same shadowy brim of a hat. It wasn't a man anymore. With a scream, I turned and ran. But the road had disappeared. I've never been a reckless person, but that night, something about the road stretched before me felt different. It was one of those rural highways where cell service vanishes, and the only illumination comes from the occasional flicker of my headlights catching the glint of reflective mile markers. The vast Tennessee wilderness swallowed the horizon, leaving nothing but darkness, fog, and the faint echo of my engine. I had taken this route because it was supposed to save time, a quiet shortcut home after a week spent working late nights in the city. But the further I drove, the more the silence seemed to weigh on me. The hum of the engine became the only sound, and even the radio refused to cooperate, spitting static whenever I tried to find a station. Around mile marker 82, I saw him, a hitchhiker, standing on the side of the road, barely visible through the thickening mist. His figure appeared suddenly, framed in my high beams like some ethereal ghost. He didn't wave or flag me down, but his posture, rigid and deliberate, seemed to imply he was waiting. His arm extended slowly, thumb pointed skyward. I don't know why I slowed down. Maybe it was guilt, maybe curiosity, maybe something I couldn't explain even now. He wore a dark, weathered coat and a faded backpack slung over one shoulder. His head was down, the brim of a wide hat casting a shadow over his face. As my car crawled closer, I found myself studying him, trying to gauge his intentions. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to keep driving, to press the gas and let the night swallow him back up. But instead, I came to a stop just a few feet ahead of him. I rolled down the window, the cool night air rushing in. "You need a ride?" The hitchhiker stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. When his face emerged from the shadows, my stomach tightened. His features were sharp, unnaturally so, as though they'd been chiseled out of stone. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the moonlight, and his eyes, I couldn't place it then, but something about them was wrong. They were dark, too dark, and when they met mine, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. Headed west, he said in a low, gravelly voice. If you're going that way, I hesitated. Something about him felt off, but I was alone on an empty road, and driving off felt too cruel. Maybe I just didn't want to admit how uneasy I was. So, against every instinct screaming at me to turn him down, I unlocked the passenger door. Hop in, I said. The hitchhiker climbed into the car without hesitation. He moved with an unsettling fluidity, and I couldn't help but notice the faint scent of damp earth as he settled into the seat beside me. His backpack thudded softly against the floor as he set it down. I started the car again, pulling back onto the road. For a moment, the silence between us felt suffocating. Thanks, he said abruptly, his voice cutting through the stillness. Not many people stop for strangers these days. I forced a weak smile, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yeah, well, I figured it's the least I could do. You headed to the next town? He didn't answer right away, and when he finally did, his tone was strange. Something like that. Something in his words made my fingers tighten on the wheel. I wanted to glance at him, to study his expression, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from the road. The mist was growing thicker, curling around the car like living tendrils. You travel a lot? I asked, trying to fill the void. He chuckled softly, a dry, hollow sound. You could say that. You? Just heading home, I replied. Late night drive. Figured the back roads would be quicker. Quieter too, he said, almost to himself. Quieter, but lonelier. I nodded, unsure how to respond. The conversation felt like a minefield, every word laced with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. After a few more miles, he spoke again. Strange, isn't it? How some roads feel alive. I risked a glance at him this time. His face was turned toward the window, his profile illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. His hat shadowed his features, but his mouth curved into the faintest hint of a smile. What do you mean? I asked, keeping my tone light. These old roads, he said, his voice almost a whisper. They've seen things. People think they're just stretches of asphalt, but they have memories, histories. A nervous laugh escaped me. Sounds like you've thought about this a lot. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto mine. You'd be surprised what you learn when you spend enough time on them. The chill in the car deepened. I turned up the heat, but the vents only sputtered lukewarm air. My unease was growing by the second, and I found myself regretting my decision to stop for him. Something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, felt inherently wrong. As we rounded a bend in the road, the car suddenly jolted, the tires thudding against something hard. I cursed under my breath, gripping the wheel tightly. Pothole? I muttered, though the words felt hollow. The hitchhiker didn't respond. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, peering through the windshield with an intensity that made my skin crawl. You might want to slow down, he said quietly. What? Why? Before he could answer, the car lurched again, this time harder. The headlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the mist. I hit the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching stop in the middle of the road. Stay here, I said, my voice trembling as I unbuckled my seatbelt. I stepped out into the cold, damp air, the fog curling around my legs like smoke. The road beneath me felt different, softer, almost spongy. I crouched to inspect the tires, but they seemed fine. No damage. No explanation for the jarring impact. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something, or someone, was standing just beyond the edge of the headlights, their silhouette barely visible through the haze. My heart thudded in my chest as I straightened up, squinting into the darkness. Hey, I called out. Who's there? No response. I backed toward the car, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I slid into the driver's seat, The hitchhiker was staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone unnervingly calm. "There's someone out there," I stammered, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. He didn't react the way I expected. No surprise, no concern. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his dark eyes glinting with something almost predatory. "You're sure it's someone?" he asked. The question sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Without answering, I threw the car into drive and pressed the gas. The tires spun against the damp pavement before catching traction, and we sped forward into the mist. But the road had changed. The straight, predictable stretch of highway I'd been traveling moments ago was gone, replaced by sharp, unnatural curves and steep inclines that seemed to defy logic. The trees lining the road were twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Panic clawed at my chest. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "What the hell is going on?" The hitchhiker didn't answer. He just sat there, silent and unbothered, as though he'd expected this all along. The mist thickened, swallowing the headlights, and the engine began to sputter. I slammed the brakes, bringing the car to an abrupt halt. It was late, and the road stretched ahead of me like an endless ribbon, swallowed in parts by creeping tendrils of fog. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it home after visiting my parents in the countryside. The night air was heavy, and the isolation of the backroads only amplified the exhaustion pulling at me. My coffee thermos sat empty in the cup holder. The clock on my dashboard blinked 1:14 a.m. Then, through the dim glow of my headlights, I saw him, a figure standing on the side of the road, arm extended, thumb pointed skyward. A hitchhiker. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Who hitches rides this deep in the middle of nowhere? The figure wasn't waving or trying to flag me down, just standing there. The closer I got, the more details became clear. A tall man, his face obscured by the hood of a dark, weathered jacket, a tattered backpack slung over one shoulder. I should have driven on. Every instinct screamed at me to keep going, to let the darkness swallow him back up. But fatigue muddled my judgment, and before I could think it through, I was easing my foot off the accelerator and pulling to the shoulder. The hitchhiker didn't rush. He walked toward the car with an unsettling calm. I rolled down the passenger window just a crack. The damp chill of the night crept in. "You headed west?" His voice was low and gravelly. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the shadow of it under the hood. "Yeah," I said, though my throat felt dry. "How far you going?" "Just the next town." He said it too quickly, like he'd rehearsed the answer. I hesitated, my hands gripping the wheel tighter. Something felt off, but it was late, and the stretch of road ahead promised nothing but more solitude. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. "Hop in." The first few miles passed in silence. He didn't say much, and neither did I. The air in the car felt heavier than it had before, and the faint smell of damp earth followed him inside, clinging like a shadow. "So," I said finally, glancing at him, "what's got you out here this late?" "Traveling," he said simply. "Kind of a strange road to hitchhike on," I pressed. "Not many cars come through here." His head turned slightly toward me, and I felt his eyes on me, though I still couldn't see much of his face beneath the hood. "It's the only road I've ever known," he said softly. Something about the way he said it made the hair on my arms stand on end. I chuckled nervously, trying to shake the feeling. "Yeah, well, it's definitely quiet." He didn't respond. The silence stretched again, long and taut, like a string ready to snap. About 10 minutes later, we came around a bend, and the fog thickened. My high beams barely pierced through the dense gray, and I had to slow down to navigate the curves. The hitchhiker shifted in his seat for the first time since getting in. "You should be careful," he said, his voice lower than before. "There are dangers on these roads." "What kind of dangers?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Things you wouldn't understand," he replied, almost absently. Then he turned his head, and for the first time I caught a glimpse of his face. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost waxy, and his eyes, dark, sunken hollows, glinted faintly in the dim light. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the road ahead. My chest felt tight. "You're not exactly reassuring, man." He let out a dry laugh, but it didn't sound amused. "Don't worry," he said. "They're not here for you. Not yet." My hands gripped the wheel harder. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, glancing at him again. His expression was unreadable, but there was a faint curl to his lips, a smile that didn't belong. The fog outside seemed thicker now, pressing against the windows like it was alive. My headlights caught fleeting shadows, shapes that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. My pulse quickened, though I told myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. "You see them, don't you?" he asked suddenly. "What?" "The shadows, the shapes." His voice was calm, almost conversational. "They're watching us." I wanted to tell him to shut up, to stop spouting whatever weird nonsense he was into, but the words caught in my throat, because I had seen them, or at least I thought I had. The road ahead began to twist in ways I didn't remember. Sharp turns, steep inclines, all shrouded in mist. My GPS had lost signal long ago, and now it felt like the road itself was conspiring against me. Then the car jolted, hard, like I'd hit something. "Damn it!" I exclaimed, gripping the wheel to keep control. The hitchhiker didn't react, didn't even flinch. I slowed to a stop and flicked on the hazard lights. "Stay here," I muttered, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to tell him. Stepping out of the car, the cold wrapped around me like a shroud. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling in unnatural patterns. I crouched to inspect the tires but found nothing, no damage, no obstruction. Then I heard it, a soft rustling coming from the woods. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. The sound grew louder, closer, like something large was moving just beyond the tree line. My breath hitched as a faint, guttural growl broke through the silence. I bolted back to the car, slamming the door shut behind me. The hitchhiker was staring at me, his expression eerily calm. "You felt it, didn't you?" "Felt what?" I snapped, throwing the car into drive. Them. The road ahead twisted unnaturally now, as if it had come alive, contorting into impossible angles. The fog outside seemed to pulse, shapes darting in and out of the shadows. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the wheel, my heart pounding. "Just keep driving," the hitchhiker said. His voice was no longer soft. It was commanding, almost inhuman. "They don't like it when you stop." "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, glancing at him. For the first time, he pushed his hood back, and I wished he hadn't. His face wasn't just pale, it was wrong. Too smooth, too perfect, like a mannequin's. His eyes were bottomless pits, black and endless, and his smile stretched wider than it should have. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he said, his tone almost pitying. The car began to sputter, the engine struggling. No, I muttered, slamming the gas, but it was no use. The car slowed to a stop, the headlights flickering before plunging us into darkness. The hitchhiker didn't move. "It's too late now," he said. "What's too late?" I shouted, panic surging. But when I turned to face him, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the door hadn't opened. I looked back at the road, and that's when I saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures emerging from the fog, their forms shifting and unnatural, their hollow eyes fixed on me. My chest tightened as they drew closer, their movements jerky, like puppets on tangled strings. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember is the fog consuming the car, the shapes pressing against the windows, and the sensation of being dragged into the dark. When I woke up, it was morning. My car was parked on the side of the road, untouched. The hitchhiker's backpack sat in the passenger seat, though he was nowhere to be found. I didn't open it. I just drove, faster than I ever had, praying I'd never see that road or him again. But every night since, I've dreamed of those shadows, and every time they're closer.